name's Claire Hanna. I'm South Belfast MP and glad to have you here for a reception to celebrate and discuss and deepen British-Irish relationships, but also wanted to use it as an opportunity to chat to you a little bit more about the New Ireland Commission and to have a conversation between John and Conor, which I'll introduce. Wanted to give you just a little bit of a top line about the Commission, about what we've been up to for the last couple of years. No doubt the Brexit process and everything that followed definitely accelerated the discussion about our constitutional future quite dramatically, and I suppose the vacuum that thankfully has been closed by the re-establishment of the Assembly just prompted a lot of thinking. And for the SDLP we went through, in terms of where our values took us as regards that conversation, and came to the conclusion, not a big departure, but that the three big challenges affecting Northern Ireland and thwarting Northern Ireland's progress were sectarianism and division, inequality and the limitations on our economy, and the border and the limiting of our potential. And it's our view that tackling them together is the best way to fulfil our potential, and I suppose to insert our values and our history into the conversation about constitutional change. We set out. We were talking about some of the different policy initiatives. There's so much going on in this space at the moment, from academia, from the Shared Island initiative, and from many others. So we didn't want to just add to maybe just facts and figures going about. So we've been, I suppose, engaging in what we call multiple levels of dialogue, which is sitting down face to face with people, very often people who haven't come from an instinctively New Ireland background, and talking to them about what their hopes are, about what their fears are, and about how we can better shape the conversation that's going to be happening over the next 10 to 20 years. So we have set out 6 principles, which I'll go through very briefly, that are going to guide our engagement. The first is reconciliation as a guiding force for what we're doing. We know that is a very overused phrase in Northern Ireland, but I suppose by that we mean that for I suppose the decades after the Good Friday Agreement, many people legitimately prioritised making Northern Ireland work, making the economy work, and I suppose bringing communities closer together. But it is our considered view that actually having this conversation is the best way to bring reconciliation into the everyday. Just avoiding it, saying it's pretty complicated, that's pretty difficult, in fact hasn't done anything to move perspectives closer together. And we find that actually, as I say, talking to people about what it is they fear in the process has been quite cathartic, and is something that we're getting a good response to. Diversity is the second one, and I suppose that's another thing that's swamped in cliches, but it's important to us. There's been a dramatic change in Ireland, north and south, in the makeup of communities and the background of who we call Irish, and a really genuine broadening of who we identify as Irish. But the next step is to properly accommodate Britishness within the Irish identity. There have been people for whom Irishness has been about not being British, and that isn't good enough for a process of constitutional change that is going to infuse hundreds of thousands of people with a very different identity into a whole new country. In that regard, we've been engaging today and at other times with the Irish in Britain, who just bring a freshness and a maturity to this conversation that I think is going to be really welcome in the longer term discussion. People who are living out the values of British, Irish and both, and very comfortably melding those parts of their identity. The third is that no one will be left behind. I know that sounds like something out of the Trolls movie sometime every time I read it, but it's about, I suppose, the failure in the last 25 years to harness the possibility of devolution to meaningfully change people's lives. And I suppose for us that is making clear that a new Ireland isn't just constitutional change for its own sake. or anything to do with demographics. It's about properly having the tools to change people's lives, change people's economic prospects, and I suppose to better replicate the economic success that's enjoyed in the South in a way that pulls people out of the difficulties they're in. The fourth is led by citizens. We're trying to repair some of the distrust that particularly in the north has resulted from the stop-start of devolution, and we're also trying to get into a process of speaking to people as individuals and not just as tribes. I characterise it sometimes as, does your unionist friend take sugar? You know, we talk about the different unionists think this and nationalists think that, but we want to genuinely make this conversation be based on the experiences we're hearing from individuals. The fifth is that we're future focused and outward looking. The past is all around us, particularly in the north, and particularly while the legacy issues have not been resolved. But the SDLP is very, very clear. This isn't about, you know, righting an historic wrong. This isn't about a victory of one tribe over the other, no matter how many decades it took. It is about something new and for the ages, and that we're not just reversing partition. That's not what we're doing. We're not going to just trap a minority in a state to which they don't have allegiance. The outward looking also speaks for itself. It's about celebrating and harnessing Ireland's place in the world and our place in the European Union. And the sixth is hope with honesty. We think there's so much potential in this conversation. We wouldn't be doing it. We wouldn't be going through all that we're going through if we didn't think it really has the potential to I suppose just fulfil the promise of people in Northern Ireland. We didn't have the potential to add to the success that has been the Republic of Ireland. So we're hopeful about that, but we're not going to gloss over all of the challenges. We're going to be honest that it doesn't mean that it's always going to, sun isn't always going to shine, everybody's not going to be gorgeous, everybody's not going to earn 200 grand a year. You know, there will be bumps and challenges along the road, and that we are perfectly prepared to explore them. So those are the sort of rules of engagement for us as we go through. Conor will chat to you a little bit more about some of the events that we've been doing and some of the themes that we've been exploring, but he's going to do that through the medium of conversation with his friend, and I think that's important. You two have known each other for a very long time, have worked with each other on a range of projects, and we thought that would be a nicer thing for you to hear rather than the traditional grilling that takes place in this building. So thank you very much, and over to Conor.
Good evening, everyone, and you're very welcome to this reception, which is celebrating British-Irish relations. And we thought, as part of that, it would be good to have a conversation. The New Ireland Commission hosts events, in conversation events, and we thought it would be a good way of reflecting on the British-Irish relationship. And we're delighted to have so many of you here. And I know many people in this room are part of the diaspora here in Britain. Many of you are activists within that community and do so many great projects and great work to engage with the Irish community here in London and across Britain. And so it was really an opportunity for us to say thank you firstly, that's why you're here, but also then hope through this conversation to share some of the work, insights that the Commission has in terms of our conversation around a new Ireland. And I'm really humbled and honoured to be joined tonight by Lord Alderdice, John Alderdice. Now, for those of you, and I'm sure most of you do know who John is, he was former Alliance Party leader, being MLA for East Belfast. He was instrumental in the Good Friday Agreement and became our first Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly. He sits in the House of Lords, now sitting with the Liberal Democrats. But John is also renowned internationally as a psychiatrist and holds many positions, but currently is Senior Fellow at Harris Manchester College and recently just appointed Fellow at Pembroke College at Oxford as well. So I'm really delighted. John has had an extraordinary life, has been pivotal in helping to build a peace process and helping to sustain that peace process. I've had the privilege of knowing John for probably a decade or so now. Claire Abbott is his friends, and I'm proud to call John a friend. And I had the privilege of working with John for a couple of years at a very interesting time, John, around the EU referendum. Lord Alderdice was the chair of the Centre for Democracy and Peace Building, and I worked with him on a programme called EU Debate NI, when we worked to develop understanding, both in Northern Ireland, around the consequences of the EU referendum. We were not trying to advocate either leave or remain, we were just trying to make sure people understood this was an important topic. And we also tried to alert people here that the consequences in Northern Ireland of Brexit would be profound. And I think back on many of the interventions you made, John, and wish that people had listened more attentively. So I'm delighted to have John here, and I wanted, I suppose, in a conversation this evening, and it will be a conversation, I'm talking a lot here, but I'll be asking John to come in a moment, but I wanted to look at issues around identity, because I think it's a huge issue in terms of the conversation of Britain, Ireland, but also around New Ireland. I want to talk about practicalities, some of the things that Claire touched upon there, about what is this conversation actually about, and what is it we actually want to achieve. And a word that John instilled in me, and which I hope through my work day in, day out, I try to exercise, is the importance of relationships. And so to talk about relationships both now and into the future. And I suppose, John, just to start at the beginning, and it's always very special and very personal to me to come to London, because, as you know, I spent my childhood here in England. It's why I have this funny accent, for those of you trying to place it. So I was born in Northern Ireland, brought up 10 years in Surrey, in England, and moved back just before the Good Friday Agreement to just outside Belfast. For those of you who are Dairy Girls fans, the character James, the English fella, that was me in the mid-90s, moving back to Northern Ireland with a very posh English accent, with no sense of any of the labels, Catholic, Protestant, Unionist, Nationalist, etc., and having to figure out my own way, as it were. And it's been a privilege and a wonderful journey that I've been able to have. But John, you, of course, I suppose we meet you now, incredible career, incredible journey, both in psychiatry, in your faith journey, in politics, everything you've achieved. Of course, home is now here, and this level, so I was thinking of that parallel. That I grew up here, but you're now residing here. So I suppose as we delve into this topic of identity, John, I was kind of interested, as someone who has now made England their home, where are you at in terms of the labels or the boxes that you find yourself either been put in, or that you would maybe be interested in now?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. And it's a little bit nostalgic in a way, because when I first became Alliance leader, one of the first things I did, in addition to arranging to meet Taoiseach, Prime Minister, various other political leaders, was to have a conversation with John Hume, in which we agreed that he would come to the Alliance Association in East Belfast, which was my constituency, and I would go to the SDLP Constituency Association in Derry, and we would, if you like, exchange platforms. And it was a very positive, it was a very fruitful kind of exercise. And it's a pity that some of that dynamic wasn't able to continue, because things they were polarised, but they became more difficult actually. And I found, recently I went back and looked at a video, it was an RTE interview. Interestingly enough, Anthony Clare, a psychiatrist, interviewing John Hume about his politics. Brilliant interview. And it just brought back to me the way John was in those early days. And it was very interesting, because he and I came to the same kind of perspective from quite different backgrounds. So for example, he developed, as you mentioned, the whole question of relationships within the North, between North and South, between Britain and Ireland, and then of course relationships with America and Europe. And he came to that really, I think, through his conviction about the European project, and how, and he spoke about it, and those of you that went to SDLP conferences will know, he spoke about this a very great deal, and how the French could still be French and the Germans could still be Germans, and so on and so on and so on. That wasn't where I came from. I came from it because I went into psychiatry. Why? because I thought, why is it that our people are harming each other and harming themselves? And I thought, well, political science doesn't help me, because political science says people operate in their best rational interest. I thought, this is nonsense. People are not acting in their rational best interest. They're damaging themselves. Who looks at that? Psychiatrist. So I went into psychiatry with the idea that if I could understand why individual people behaved in self-damaging ways, maybe I could understand why a whole community behaved in a self-damaging way. And that basically took me on a whole trajectory. But one of the things about that was that it took me to understanding the nature of relationships, not just individual relationships, but relationships with families and groups and communities and so on. So I was coming to this business of relationships from that kind of background, partly in medical health, psychiatry, partly a kind of intellectual exploration. John was coming to it from political experience, and also, I mean, he had a very fine mind, as you know. And I might say that one of the things that I've been discussing with you and with other colleagues is having a seminar in Belfast next year, where we will take the 2 Nobel Prize laureates and look at the development of their thinking, the development of John Hume's thinking, because it did develop, and the development of David Trimble's thinking, because it actually did develop as well. And I think that's important for people to think about that. So what does that mean? Well, what it means in identity terms is, as my wife often says, it doesn't matter how long we live in England, we're never going to be English. You know, we're not. We're Irish. We're Northern Irish people. And if there was any other identity that would be relatively close to me, it's probably more likely to be Scottish, because I'm a Presbyterian by background and largely by conviction. I wouldn't say exclusively so, but nevertheless. But there are a lot of things about Scotland, about the Scottish Enlightenment, which for me are really very important things. And I would have much more of a sense of identification with that. And I think that's true actually of quite a lot of people in the Northern Unionist community. People often think that their identifications with here. It's not with here at all. You know, people like Sammy Wilson that say the most appalling things about English people. But Scotland, that's completely different. You know? And people often don't tease these things out really terribly well. And so for me, the identity is, you know, I'm Irish, I'm from the north, I'm Northern Irish, but I live here in England, I love it, it's great. I think my wife's particularly pleased to get away from a lot of the kind of tension and difficulty and unpleasantness that there can sometimes be in public life. Our kids are all over here, our grandchildren are all over here. And she said to me, "Your home is over there, and why am I sitting here in Belfast?" You know. So that would be where I come from with identity. And of course, the other thing about it is, and John said this in this particular interview. He talked about diversity. He said we're the most diverse people in the world. We travel all over the place, and we are complex in our identities. There are all sorts of elements to our identities which are important. And the problem about division and particularly violence is that it oversimplifies your identity. You've got to be here or here, you know?
I think it's really interesting, John, because for me, it's in the work that we are doing, and as we're having the conversations, of course, we're all going through journeys ourselves on identity and how our identities evolve. For me, there is actually something in the answer to all of this, which is about accepting the complexity of identity, that we can be multiple identities, that people can move in their identity. And I suppose if we could, in order to affect change, you have to understand the problem. In terms of having a conversation about the future, whether that be within the Union or whether that be in New Ireland, is identity, is that the fault line?
It became a fault line. It doesn't have to be so. If one accepts two things, one of which you've mentioned, which is complexity. When somebody asks you who you are, if the only thing that you can say is I'm Irish or I'm British, you know, you either have a pretty shallow identity or you're not really thinking about the complexity of who you are. Because there are a whole lot of different aspects to you and yourself. And when there is violence, it polarizes things and it magnifies that element of your identity. But if you can stop killing, if you can start to settle that down, and that became the kind of first agenda item for me, was stop the killing. You can't think of anything at all until you stop the killing. But once you do that, it begins slowly to become possible to look at the complexity of who we are and all the different kinds of. The second word that's really important is pluralism. And as you know, we've talked about this before, that with Isaiah Berlin's notion of pluralism. And basically, what he's saying is, look, I mean, he says an awful lot of things, but one of the things he says, look, if you want to be accepted by others who differ from you, then you've got to be prepared to accept other people who differ from you. And it's one of the, this used to be a very strong liberal principle. Unfortunately, many of my liberal colleagues have become really very intolerant of difference, of people who have a different perspective from them. And I just think it's incredibly important, because we don't just differ because we don't know enough about each other. We differ because we actually have very different perspectives, very different values. One of the reasons it's incredibly important, that our Chinese friends have a wholly different culture from us. If we ever get over this question with the Russians, which we will be into the question of whether or not there's a war between China and the West. And if we're not going to have a war, then we're going to need to understand much more deeply a profoundly different culture, which can't be simplified or homogenized into something that we all live in some kind of a middle-sized mush. We do differ, genuinely. The question is, can we live with that difference? And I think that's something that John was strong about. I think it's something that SDLP have been very strong about. Certainly something that people from an alliance background felt very importantly. But we need to we need to think about it more. We need to understand, well, how does that actually work out? How do you implement pluralism? That's what the Good Friday Agreement was essentially about.
And I wanted to come on.
And that's what the Assembly ought to have been about.
Yeah, because we're into a very interesting space, because in Northern Ireland, as I learned in 1997, moving back, you could put in a box. And so we very quickly, are you unionists and nationalists? And of course, what has been emerging in recent times has been this group called Other, that many alliance people would say they are. One of the interesting things that's happening, John, to your pluralism point is, of course, when we as nationalists say New Ireland, we mean for all the traditions, unionists, nationalists, other, everybody. Is there a danger, and I suppose, and I accept there are people within unionism who want to build an Northern the union for all of them. How do we make sure that pluralism happens, whatever the outcome is? What is the role, as a former alliance, what is the role of alliance in that regard in terms of the pluralism outcome? Rather than putting a tent over people that are called other, if you see the point I'm making.
One of the things that's important is accepting and understanding that, setting aside the politics for the moment, there are lots of other ways in which people differ.
Yeah.
And as you know, one of the areas that I regard as being important is the area of faith. And many people who would not describe themselves as Protestant or Catholics or Orthodox or Hindus or Muslims, or nevertheless the notion of spirituality of some kind remains important for them. Now, there's been a tendency to either run away from that or diminish the value of it. And it seems to me that there's something in there that's actually very important to an awful lot of people. And trying to construct a society that values those kinds of differences, and lots of other important differences as well. Now, I notice a change. When I was leading the Alliance Party, I would have said that on balance, if you had said to people, well, if there's a vote tomorrow, would you vote to stay in the United Kingdom or not? That, not all, but a very substantial majority of people would say, yes, I mean, I think that's in the best interests. As I look at how things have developed since then, I think that has changed. There are lots of other things that have changed. I did a few interviews last year where I said that one of the things unionists needed to understand was how much things have changed over here.
Yes, I think you said that the emotional attachment of England is gone.
It's gone. When I first came, I came to the Lords, 27 years ago. My beard was black in those days. And you would have found a lot of people, men, for example, who had fought in the war with people from Northern Ireland. And there was a kind of comradely attachment. Absolutely none of that now. There is no emotional attachment over this side of the water at all. And I wanted to say that to unionist people, to say, look, the union that you're wanting to be part of doesn't exist anymore. In a whole lot of ways it doesn't exist. What was interesting to me was, if I'd said that 5 or 10 years before, I would have been viciously attacked, as you know. That didn't happen. people often, some people say, well, we don't like you saying things like that, or even that's not very helpful, John. But quite a lot of people said, we don't like hearing you saying that, John, but we know it's actually true. And I said, well, then you need to think about that. You need to work through and think about the consequences of that. I think there are also other interesting developments, some of which you referred to in your introductory remarks, which people in the nationalist community need to explore as well. Because, I mean, as Claire quite rightly said, this isn't simply a question of one bunch of people having to think about their future. And I talked, not very long ago, I met with a guy, I hadn't seen him for about 40 years. I used to be very much involved in the Ecumenical Youth Council of Europe. So there's young people from all over. And at that time, this was, Cold War was still going on, Berlin Wall was still there. But there were some young people from places like Germany and Poland who were allowed to come and meet with us in places like Switzerland and so on. And there was a guy called Dietrich Gutsch who was from East Germany. And being an old greybeard now, whenever they were having some kind of anniversary of 50 years of it or something like that, they invited a few of us to come along and see how much things had changed and stuff like that. And I met Dietrich, I hadn't met him for a long time. And I said, oh, well, Dietrich, how are you? He said, I'm not very happy. And I said, what's wrong? In Germany, back United, doing very well. Well, he said, yes, you can think about it in that way if you like. But will I tell you what happened? He said, I was a communist. To me, that was important. There were various principles there. And when Germany was reunited, if you want to talk about it in those terms, nobody asked us what we wanted. It was a takeover. Nobody sat down and said, what flag do you want? What constitution do you want? What things out of your background in terms of socio-economic way that East Germany operated, what things do you want to maintain, what things do you not want to maintain? Nobody asked us any questions like that. It was just a simple takeover. He said, so many years later, I still resent all of that. We still wanted to be part of a conversation that said, let's as Germans all come together and we can produce a new Germany. And it seems to me that that's one of the really important things about the conversation that you're promoting. It's not saying, well, look, just recognize the game's over, guys, we're taking over again. But rather saying, no, wait a minute. We actually want to create something new, something tolerant, pluralist, something that recognizes difference, something that values that degree of diversity. And we went through something that polarized us. Well, there's a lot of work to get beyond that, but it's worthwhile. It's important work.
And we'll come on in a moment. One of the things, as you know, I'm relatively late into politics and joining, as I did the SDLP, becoming outwardly and coming out as a nationalist. People's reaction to that was fascinating. People sort of screwing their face up a little bit. I'm a bit they're a bit disappointed. Like there's something wrong with being nationalist. Something. Why don't you just make Northern Ireland work? Why don't you just be a good boy and settle down? When everything's good, then we can do all this.
Yeah.
And I do wonder. I think it's a really interesting, and I'd be interested in your perspective of this, because of course the agreement enshrines the right of nationalist republics to advocate their vision through just as equally it does for unionists. And I suppose is there a danger, in sort of the status quo being seen as, well, it's better that than anything else because everything else is uncertain? Is that dangerous, sticking to a status quo, not allowing people to advocate for change? Because in most societies, the people who are advocating for change would be encouraged, or, well done, that's good, instead of advocating for the status quo. And it's why we have put reconciliation very much at the heart of this project, because we're saying that the way in which you have the conversation, just as you've outlined, can in itself, if done right, be a process of reconciliation. But why is it that the status quo is going to deliver reconciliation?
I don't think the status quo will. I mean, I think the truth of it is that things are changing. And it isn't always the case that people who are advocating change are welcomed. I got quite down about the way things were going globally a few years ago. And then when it came to 2017, I was thinking quite a lot about what had happened 500 years before, which was Luther nailing his 95 Theses to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg. And from my point of view, others will be different, that was an important step forward. It was challenging, it introduced new ways of thinking within the religious community, and then went on to contribute to the Enlightenment and political change and so on and so forth. But it didn't produce peace, stability and reconciliation, it produced the wars of religion. because there were a whole bunch of people who said, we don't want this to change. You know, if we'd been sitting around in a building like this 500 years ago with a few glasses of wine in front of us, it's a terrible business, all this, you know, this printing thing. You know, print all sorts of stuff. Dangerous, dangerous business. And in people's own language as well. Oh, goodness gracious, it'll be a disaster. It'll wreck everything. And in a sense, for them, it did. Because it did upend all of these things. And so, when you have change, there are always winners and losers. There are those who didn't want it to change. So you shouldn't be surprised that people would be a bit iffy and screw the... I mean, you mentioned that. I remember what happened when my mother told my grandmother, who was a wee Baptist woman from East Belfast, said to her, John's got involved. Well, it's very nice he's got involved in politics, but I do wish it had been the Ulster Unionist Party. And I thought, she really hasn't a clue who I am at all, or what's important to me. So I don't think you should be surprised that there are people who will be negative about change of any description, because they assume that the change is going to be a negative thing for them. And in some ways it will be a negative thing for them. That doesn't mean you don't do it. It doesn't mean that you don't make the effort to help them to understand how, in the developing new world that there will be possibilities for them, and you try to open doors. But you know, the Good Friday Agreement really created the opportunity for new sets of relationships. And the problem is that the unionist community as a whole, there were some who did grab it with both hands, but the political unionist community as a whole did not take that opportunity. And I sometimes say that the unionist leadership were too stupid to realise they'd won, and the nationalist and Republican community were too smart to admit they'd lost. And actually what happened because of that was that nationalist ambitions have been able quietly, slowly, but absolutely clearly to develop, while the unionist perspective has shrunk and shriveled and fragmented and is dissolving. Now, it's really very important to then engage as you're doing with them. The challenge, I think, I have to say, is for you, for colleagues like that, to become clearer about what the offer is to unionists. You know, what is it that the offer is? What are you saying? Are you saying, well, look, just join us, we'll have the same flag, the same national anthem, you won't have any NH, and so on and so on. Or are you saying, no, wait a minute. In fact, I have to say that Mary Lou MacDonald made a very interesting intervention at the 25th anniversary event. It was a panel which the 5 parties were represented, and Mark Simpson was interviewing. And he said something like this. And she said, well, I'm not trying to persuade anybody to stop being British. In fact, I think that they should be able to continue in the United Ireland to have British passports. And Mark went, wait a minute, say that again? She said, well, I think, why shouldn't I? I mean, at the moment, within the United Kingdom, they're able to have Irish passports, so why within the United Ireland? She said it might be a problem for the British Home Office, but it's not a problem for us. And I thought, that's exactly the kind of intervention that makes unions say, oh, wait a minute, that wasn't what I expected at all. I need to think about this. And I think there are unions who are prepared to think.
Well, and I was going to come up because that, we have found another identity, John, in this work, and that's the unity curious. This whole category of people. And your Colin will tell, and Claire will tell you, people come up to us at events and they sort of hunch in and they go, I'm with you. And they're always the people you would maybe have labelled as British or unionist. And we are finding more and more through our workshops, through our town hall meetings, that there is this class of people that are unity curious. And it's interesting, because back to the identity conversation where people say, you know, look, I'm up for this conversation. I'm interested in a new Ireland based on what you're setting out, but I couldn't be a nationalist. And it's where people they're to use Claire Handel, discombobulating their sense of things. We go, well, actually, this is a movement to build something together.
It's really important to understand, you don't need to be a nationalist to vote for United Ireland. You don't need to be a unionist to vote to stay in the United Kingdom. You know, nationalism has a particular set of perspectives. But there are lots of people who may well be prepared to be perfectly accepting of being in the United Ireland, but they would not describe themselves as nationalists, because there's a whole package of other things that comes with that. And similarly on the union side, there have long been people. I mean, I used to find it a bit frustrating that simply because I said, well, I think it's in the best interest of people staying within the United Kingdom, at that point might change. People never believed I was serious whenever I said that, but I was. But they said, well, then you're a unionist. I said, no, I'm not a unionist. I believe at the moment that it's in the best interests of people to stay within the United Kingdom. But that may very well change. And one of the things that really did change it profoundly for many people was Brexit. And the second thing that changed it was Boris Johnson becoming the Prime Minister. He said, you know, that is not, I have no identification with that at all.
Yeah.
I mean, you know.
But it's not something you and I discussed when we were doing the EU debate. I remember in February, before the EU referendum, we gave evidence actually in this very building, and one of the things that you were warning is that whatever happened in that referendum, English nationalism was going to win the referendum. Because you understood that something had shifted in British politics, in English politics, and in many ways the last 8 years has been the outworking of that. And I think Boris Johnson obviously epitomised that symbolism of English nationalism, which is not good, as we agreed at the time, not good for anybody in Ireland, whether you be unionist, nationalist or another tradition.
Absolutely. And you know, the thing is, sometimes people, in their very personality, in their very selves, embody the community that they come from. I mean, people often say things like, oh, well, you know, if only the new leaders or things would be different. People become elected as leaders because in their very personality, they represent the personality of the community. And if you want to understand the community, if you want to get anywhere with it, then you need to take seriously the kind of person that they are. You know, the difference between, for example, I can speak about both of them because they're not around anymore, but the difference between, you know, Jim Molyneux and Ian Paisley was, Jim was in his personality quite a dependent sort of character. You know, he always had to have somebody bigger than himself there, whether it was Enoch Powell or Ian Paisley or whatever. And that was really emblematic of that kind of unionism, which was very dependent on the link with the rest of the United Kingdom. Ian Paisley was a very different kind of unionist. It was angry, bombastic, and so on, who actually didn't represent that kind of unionism at all. It was more a sort of independent, angry Ulsterman than it was. He had no serious attachment to England at all. And in the end, it was quite interesting. There were a couple of interviews a little while ago, one with Arlene Foster and one with Eileen Paisley. And they asked the two of them the same question in separate interviews. The question was, what would you do if a majority of people voted to go into United Ireland? And Arlene said, Eileen, wouldn't be my country. That's not what Eileen said. Eileen said, this is my country. And as long as I'm not being discriminated against because I'm a Protestant, I will not be leaving. I won't vote for it, but if it happens, I won't be leaving the country. And by the way, my Ian and Martin got on remarkably well together, and things have changed in this part of the world. And I thought, yeah, that's the difference between that tradition that Ian represented and the tradition that Jim represented, in their very personalities.
Yeah.
And it's true of all the rest as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, John, we've sort of touched upon process here, and I think we're agreed this is addressing complexity, being open to the complexity, embracing the complexity. It's about having conversations, as many conversations as we can, to develop that understanding. And I think you touched upon, and I remember you sharing many stories around both the agreement and as we watched Brexit unfold, around practicalities. Focus on the practicalities, focus on the things that matter to people's lives. One of the things that we have been looking at in depth is professors at Queen's University in Ulster have done incredible work looking at the issue of cancer service provision on the island of Ireland. There is something that I'm pretty sure whatever community we go into, anywhere on the island of Ireland, whatever, and said, we have a plan to make the provision of cancer service better by adopting this plan, people will put their hands up. These are the kinds of things that we can do now, we should do. Do you think those ingredients demonstrate the right approach to how we take forward the conversation about the kind of society we want to be about, the kind of UN that we are articulating?
I think there's two aspects to it. The first is exploring those practical issues. I remember when we were in the talks process and the question arose about cross-border bodies. And I went home and I thought, how are we going to persuade unionists to engage with this conversation. Because the Shinners were talking all the time about all Ireland bodies, and you knew that that was just going to create allergies. So we started thinking about it, and we went back, as you will well remember, to the fact that there had been a cross-border body, which was the Foyle Fisheries Commission. And that was because the fish didn't recognise the border. They would just swim backwards and forwards all the time. And there were a lot of men, mostly, who liked fishing. And if it was going to work in the Foyle and in the Foyle Basin, there was going to have to be some kind of accommodation. And so there was. And so what we're starting to say to the unions was, you're not betraying your predecessors by agreeing to a cross-border body, because you've got a model of a cross-border body, which Stormont agreed to and worked for years and years and years. And the answer I got back after a conversation or two was, look, if there are practical propositions that make social and economic sense and are not pushing a particular political agenda, then we can talk about that. We can even agree to some of that. It's where we feel that these are being used as a Trojan horse to take us to a place that we don't want. And so I think there are lots of... Now, some of these things are more complicated than they might appear. I mean, I, as a psychiatrist, did a lot to try to develop, in my particular subspecialty of psychotherapy, cross-border bodies that would address psychological issues. And one of the things I discovered was that the distance between Belfast and Dublin was far more than the geographical distance.
Absolutely.
And it was really quite... If you had it in Belfast, it was very difficult to get people to come up from the south. And if you had it in Dublin, it was very difficult to get people to come down from the north. And there's a lot more where it wasn't the practicalities of it. There were different health services based on different principles. And you had to find ways of having conversations about that recognised that and didn't dismiss one or the other. I mean, one of the things that I said to some of the Shinners is, don't go around immediately talking about wanting an NHS in United Ireland, because the NHS is falling to bits. The NHS is completely broken and it's not fixable. It's a model that doesn't work. So start having conversations about what might work. And you're right, cancer services, psychological services, there are various kinds of things. But then you come to some practical problems. When I started talking, for example, about collaboration on policing issues, and I went down to talk to some of the people in Dublin about it. First of all, I went and had a meeting with the Garda Commissioner. And as soon as the Minister of Justice in Dublin discovered it, he said, why are you allowing this boy to come down here and have conversations with us? I mean, no, we shouldn't be allowing that sort of thing. So actually the pushback that I was getting coming down from the north was actually from the Justice Minister in the south. And then as I started talking to some of them about, well, look, would it not be possible for some folks from the Garda Síochána to take, in those days, the RUC, to take secondments to the RUC, and RUC officers to take secondments to the Garda Síochána. And the problem that really stood in the way was they couldn't find a way of sorting out the pension arrangements. If you went down for a couple of years to the south or came up, your pension arrangements didn't transfer. And why should young people be taking disadvantage and so on? And so there's practical things that can sometimes stand in the way, absurdly, of the kind of collaboration that you want. We are just too small a place, either north or south, to accommodate many of the medical specialties. But if you put us all together, then it actually makes some kind of sense and we can do things. So I think there's two things that need explored there. One is the offer to northern unionists. We can collaborate in these things, you're not betraying your... But there's another conversation nationalists in the north need to have. And that's with nationalists in the south. Because there's a lot of nationalists in the south that are absolutely unsure. I remember during the talks process, a very senior Irish official came to me and he said, John, I've just been thinking, if we had a United Ireland, boy like Willie McRae there now, could be the Minister of Agriculture or something like that. I said, that's absolutely right. He said, I'm going off the notion.
Well, that's why obviously the work we have been engaged in has been having those conversations with the broad spectrum of nationalism in the South, because that is absolutely... Well, it goes back to the conversation we had earlier around understanding each other. Because how we understand each other is critical to what we do together next. And that sort of takes me to the final thing I wanted to just touch upon, John, which is a mantra that I often can hear you saying in my head is, Conor, it's all about relationships.
Yes.
And I think that's a line you've used throughout your political career. I've heard you say it many times. It's how the agreement was achieved. It's how any progress has been achieved. And I suppose influenced me, but also, I suppose, very much the approach of the Commission when I look at the diversity of groups and people that we have engaged with. I'm very proud that that has been a model of relationship building and engagement. What I want to maybe just sort of, given your sort of faith, psychology, political coming together in one person, is the theme of reconciliation. We talk about it's our objective as a Commission. We believe both the process of conversation can be reconciliation, and obviously we want to achieve a reconciled island for all the traditions on the island of Ireland. So I've thought a lot about this connect between the word relationships and the word reconciliation. And I just give a very quick example of a workshop we did, which was with a range of loyalist women's groups in Shankill. 62 women took part with the New Ireland Commission. It was a 3-hour event. We did a public workshop with them, private workshop with them. We engaged with them around their fears, their hopes, and the issues that were important to them. I wish I could show you the movie of it because it was a fascinating conversation. It was honest, it was very, very challenging and testy at times. But there was huge respect in the room because throughout I remained honest, but also respectful to the opinions. The fears that were relayed were shocking. Well, when I say New Ireland, what does it mean to you? We'll be killed, we'll be put on boats. And these were genuinely held fears. And obviously that is the absolute antithesis of anything that we wanted to talk about or that we would mean by the term New Ireland. But the extraordinary thing that happened by the workshop is that these women started talking about their community and what they wanted and their hopes for the future, the kind of society they wanted to see. And a lot of the values and the principles that we were talking about were chiming with them. And for me, at the end of that workshop, 2 things happened. We asked them, would they attend a future event? Every one of them, every 62 of those women ticked to say they would come to a future event. That to me was extraordinary moment of reconciliation. Not because they'd agreed to join a New Ireland or that they'd somehow been converted to something, but because they were prepared to think differently about something that before they'd gone into the room, they thought very negatively or very badly about. So I suppose I have a question, which is that relationship, is that process, can we call that reconciliation? Is that, or is reconciliation something even more beyond that?
I think reconciliation is like the stars. It can guide you, but you never get there. Because there are profound differences, and recognizing and accepting those is necessary for meaningful relationships. And if I might say, I think there's one thing about the terminology of a New Ireland, which I know it's not what we mean, but it's one of the things to be thoughtful about. There has never ever been a time when relationships within the island of Ireland were entirely separate from relationships with the other island. It wasn't that you could draw a line around that island and say, well, we're separate off from the others. And in fact, in that interview that I mentioned earlier on that John did, the analogy that he used for modern day resolutions of problems was the analogy of Columba, who of course famously went to Iona and had a huge impact not just in Scotland and in England but right across Europe. Because that piece of sea was not a barrier to the other island, it was a channel of communication with the other island. And I think that's one of the things that people from the nationalist community need to be careful about, is seeing their approach as being one that draws a line around their community over against another community. And it's a danger for all of us in political parties. You're in my party and we're out to deal with these guys over here who have a different perspective. And I know that that's neither your agenda nor indeed the SDLP's agenda. But it's one of the things that we always have to be conscious. And it's not, relationships are not something that gets sorted. If you have a relationship and you think it's sorted, it's already in trouble because you think it's sorted, right? Relationships are dynamic things, they're organic things that you need to work with all the time and grow them and develop them and understand that they will move back and forward. And so when you talk about reconciliation, it is something to be wished for and to be aimed for, but we'll never get there because there will always be important differences that we must respect. But in a way, that's the key word. It is that you respect. The most toxic thing in relationships for communities and individuals is humiliation and disrespect.
Absolutely.
You can disagree all you like, go and have a drink afterwards.
And I think that we have many examples from
Absolutely.
that day to the many other where that is absolutely at the core. John, you need a well-earned drink after talking and voting this evening as well. But just before we draw to a close, I have two sort of final questions. One is, I suppose, in the conversation that we're having, and you very generously shared so much of your thinking and thoughts and been very open on that. Is this, the fact you're taking part in this conversation, what does that say? Does that say I'm open to this possibility? Does it say I'm an advocate for this kind of project? We'll be doing one of these in concert with Jimmy Nesbitt, the actor who calls himself now I'm a New Islander. Are you there, or are you open to the conversation and debate? Where are you at in terms of this conversation?
I'm open to the development of the relationships, wherever that takes us. I think I have to be a little careful that I have come to live on this side of the water, and people in Northern Ireland might quite reasonably say, well, if you're that keen, why the devil aren't you still living here? We often say about Irish Americans, they'll do anything for Ireland except actually live in the place. So I'm a little careful about how I describe it. But for me, the first step along the road was to stop Irish people killing each other. And then it is to develop relationships, not just within Ireland. The religious community that I come from had really important relationships with Scotland, and indeed with the Netherlands and Switzerland and Germany. So I don't want to be following a road that says, let's pull up the drawbridge and all get on well together inside the castle. And I think that's one of the things that nationalism, more than nationalists, that nationalism needs to be careful about, because it's always a temptation. And it's particularly a temptation when there are existential threats around in the world, as there are now. So I'm a little careful about using that kind of language. For me, the commitment is to develop and deepen relationships in which there is respect for those with whom I differ. And the ambition is to develop a way of implementing pluralism in political practice. I asked Henry Hardy, who was the person who wrote a lot about Isaiah Berlin and knew him very well. I said, what did Isaiah Berlin propose as a way of implementing pluralism? He said, I'm a philosopher, not a political scientist. That's for them to work out. And actually, I think, one of the things that we did in the Good Friday Agreement was to create a model of pluralism implemented in politics. Now what we have to try to do is make sure it gets implemented and indeed developed. It wasn't the end of the story. But I'm careful about using the language that you describe, because I think it wouldn't mirror where I'm coming from or where I intend to go to, because for me it turns too much into the island rather than opening to a wider Europe and world. and that's why I'm cautious about adopting.
Which is where we've work to do to persuade and to work on, but obviously the
I don't
EU
think
dimension.
if what you want is people to be prepared to sign up for Ireland coming together, they do not all need to become nationalists.
No, that's right.
They simply need to get to the point where they say, look, on balance, this would be a better political arrangement for these towns. And you have to be a little bit careful that you don't try too hard to go further than is actually necessary.
Yeah.
So for me, when people say, are you working for reconciliation? I say, well, yes, of course I am, but actually what I'm working for is to stop the killing.
Yeah.
And that's a big enough ambition for my political lifetime. We've now stopped the killing. So now there's a possibility of doing all sorts of things that weren't possible before. I think one needs to be a little bit careful that you don't make the perfect the enemy of the good.
I think they're wise words, John. And to finish this conversation, you shared with me a paper that you gave in August 1995.
Yeah.
So I think it was just after the first IRA in County Mayo. And you said there is no need to betray the future because of there is no need to betray the future because of fears of the past or the problems of the present. I think it's very sound words. All these years later, that we should be open to those conversations, we shouldn't be afraid of having those conversations. And at this reception to Marks of British-Irish Relations, I think you've given us a lot of food for thought, not just for how we develop relationships on the island of Ireland, but how we develop relationships across these islands. And I think that's the big message we'll take away tonight. But can I ask you all just to thank John for sharing his thoughts? Swid is going to put in here the SDLP. He's going to say a few words now.
Thanks very much, Conor, and of course, thanks to John for being here and for sharing your thoughts. I mean, I think you have earned the right, by the way, to have an opinion about the future of Ireland. Anybody who was in the room when the Good Friday Agreement was signed has earned a lot more than that. So we're very grateful for all of that. It was great to listen to the conversation, particularly about relationships. And I think one of the keys we're making in this case is to explain to people on this island that we want to actually have a better relationship. One of the things that has happened since Brexit is that all of that good work post 98 has been really destroyed, you know, and I would blame a lot of people who I have to sit across the chamber from actually in this place for a lot of that, and it has been very damaging. And part of the job that we're now engaged in, fast forwarded probably because of Brexit, is to rebuild those relationships, not just among communities in Northern Ireland and across the island of Ireland, but also across these islands. And that, I think, is a prize worth having. I set up the New Ireland Commission a couple of years ago. Yes, I think in response largely to Brexit, where this conversation just became so present in places where you wouldn't have expected it. And people tell me unionism isn't involved in this conversation. Well, I can tell you they're absolutely talking to us. When we have to send Conor to places like the Shankill Road to get a good roasting like he got that day. But it was amazing because people were, you know, hostile and then interested and talking and listening, and that's how you build whatever kind of reconciliation we can build. But it's definitely how we build relationships. I do get very frustrated 25 years after we signed the Good Friday Agreement when people, some of whom in your former party actually, tell us we can't be talking about a United Ireland, or we have to have reconciliation first, or we have to fix the health service first, or we have to fix the economy. Well, actually we're talking about a New Ireland because we want to fix the health service because it's a basket case. We want to fix the economy because far too many of our young people are leaving the north of Ireland to get a job, and we want to reconcile our communities, and we think this conversation and building a New Ireland is actually the best way to reconcile our communities, because the status quo hasn't worked. And I do think now, for young people, 25 years ago may as well be 100 years ago. And I do think they're now saying, that's great, we've got peace, what's next? Why should we be satisfied with an assembly that has sat 2 out of the last 7 years, an economy that isn't working, a health service that you can't get access to, you have to go to the credit union to borrow money to get a routine procedure. I think young people are now saying, what's next? And I don't think they're going to be okay with political leaders, whether they be in the north of Ireland or in Dublin, saying, you're okay now, you stay in your little box, be happy, we got you peace, didn't we? That's enough out of you. That's just not going to happen. And this is why we're very engaged now in this conversation, because we can do this badly. And I think we will end up, by the way, voting for constitutional change in one way or another. But we could do that after having a mess of a process, or we could do that in a way that allows us to build a nation that we could all be proud of. And that's the kind of conversation that we want to be engaged in. So we'll continue this, and we've had some conversation today with some of the Irish community in London, and we're going to continue that. We're going to go to hard places right across the island and across this island, and in America next month doing the same, because this is hard work. And the build up to the agreement that all you guys were in a room for a few days delivering took 2 decades at least. And I remember watching an interview of John Hume outside of Stormont, just as when Sunningdale had collapsed, and there was no sense in his voice in that interview or any of the rest of them that it was going to take another 20 odd years to get back around that table. But it's exciting work, and it's work that we're going to continue, and we're going to have to keep having this conversation. And particularly, I think the people who are going to be most important at the end of all of this are the people that used to vote for you, people who are voting for Alliance, the other. And I do think it would be better if we were all able to have a proper, engaged debate. We're not told to be quiet, and we'll talk about that another day. I just don't think people are going to accept that. So it's been wonderful to have you here, and I'm very grateful for everybody for turning up. This is the beginning of a conversation, not the end, and there's a fair bit of wine left, so enjoy yourselves.
Thank you.